Your voice, your opinion, your community. Fact TV, free speech protected.
Hello and welcome to the New Commons. I'm Johanna Laurie, and my co-host John Michael DeMay is not with me today. He's unable to make it, but my guest Sarah Wilton has been here. She was with us a few weeks ago, and she is going to be continuing to talk about a subject that we started with her back then that was called Ukraine, Pawn in a Geopolitical Tug of War. And if you recall, Sarah has a career in Naval Intelligence, and she has, all of her life, she's been especially interested in Russia and in the other nations right around Russia, Eastern European nations. And she now belongs in retirement to a group called Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, which carries on a lot of the good work that she did while she was employed. These are all people, many of whom are very well known, who are trying to help people understand, if not from the sidelines, chart a better course for American foreign policy, because we certainly need some help in that realm. So I thought that I would just review really quickly what we talked about last time, because we had a lot of things we talked about. We talked about the recent history of the tensions in Ukraine, how that came about. We talked about the Minsk Accords. We talked about Putin invading Ukraine last February, and somewhat about the special operation could have been avoided. We talked about our claims that this was totally unprovoked, unjustified, and Putin's claims, of course, that is totally provoked and justified. And the question, of course, is who is right? We talked about the American media coverage of the war in Ukraine, in which we and the Zelensky government are always the good guys and the Russians are always the bad guys. And of course, if you listen to Russian media, I'm sure you're going to hear the exact opposite. So there's a question of why the media coverage is so biased, and we may get into that at some point too. The U.S. claims that we're only indirectly involved in this war, but as you can see from the title of our program, we feel that, and anybody who really looks deeply in this war realizes that indeed we are very and totally involved in this war, indirect though some of it is right now. Then what is the end game? Can Ukraine survive all of the destruction and dismemberment that's going on right now? Can we avoid a possible nuclear war with Russia? These are the big questions, and of course, we're wondering what as Americans we can do. So these questions will come up as we do something kind of interesting. We were excited to get a couple of comments. We asked for people who wanted to, after our program, to send us comments, and we did get two. I have to say that one was much more respectful than the other, and I'm going to remind people, because we, on the very first program we had, we laid out what were the rules of civil conversation that we wanted people to follow. And this bears repeating because, as I say, one person who commented really held to that, and the other person didn't. We asked that people try to reach a shared understanding rather than constantly win an argument. We asked that people clarify when they are talking with others or writing with others so that they generally understand what the other person has said. We asked them to avoid committing logical fallacies in support of their own claims. We asked them to think about their own biases and try to understand that they might have biases as well as everybody else. We asked people to be reasonable, rational, and create coherent arguments. We asked them to refrain from personal attacks, sarcasm, and mean-spiritedness. And to generally be receptive to changing their mind, or at least considering other points of view if there are compelling arguments and evidence that supports it. So just keep this in mind, because what we're going to be doing then next is we're going to be taking these questions that the two people sent to us, and actually they weren't so much, they were more comments than questions, and then you can, because actually those of you who see this program, you could see these comments online. They send them to us online. And then you can compare what it is that we're saying and what it is that they're saying, and you can exercise your own abilities to reason and see where you think, where you think the truth may come down. So starting with the first question, or the first comment, which had to do with NATO expansion and with how that occurred, how would you like to start that? This is all, I could read some of it. Shall I read what the person said to us?
Oh, I think it's better. I will try to address their points in my responses.
Okay.
Basically, if we could see the map of NATO expansion, the comment about the NATO expansion was justified, I think, is the classic position of the U.S. and the U.K. and that Gorbachev was not made promises. First of all, Gorbachev announced that the Cold War had ended at the UN in December 1988. It was after that the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact collapsed in 1991, and then it was after that NATO started formally expanding. And the commenter who justified NATO expansion used the reference of Katrina Spohr, S-P-O-H-R, and her work, and that is the classic U.S.-UK position. But I'm here to represent that there are other positions from the U.S. and outside of the U.S. that think that take the Russian perspective, that the NATO expansion was a threat. And some of these other perspectives are Jack Matlock, former ambassador to the former U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union under George H.W. Bush, and before that, Ronald Reagan. Sorry, it should have been Ronald Reagan. Stephen F. Cohen, I have one of his books here. This one in particular deals with the Russiagate phenomenon, but he alludes to Russia's threat from NATO expansion and the 2014 U.S. orchestrated coup in Ukraine, and he challenges the notion that the Western perspective that NATO expansion was not a threat or was justified. And you also have Richard Sakwa, who is a Kent University professor. Kent is in the UK, and he's written numerous books about detailing the events of 2014 in the Maidan coup, and also relationships, bilateral relations with the West and Russia. I also would like to point out, this will deal with the first responder mentioning the ethnicity of Ukraine. This is covered in, by one of my former professors in this volume, Political Culture and Civil Society in Russia and the New States of Eurasia. So those are some of the resources that are challenging the narrative of the two responders. But first of all, I would just like to preface, why do Russia's positions matter? First of all, Russia is geographically part of Europe. The United States is not part of Europe. And since the UK withdrew from the European Union, the United Kingdom is not even part of the European Union. Anyway, Russia, half of Russia is in Europe. And furthermore, it was Russia that contributed to the defeat of Nazi Germany. One can conclude from that they're a European power, they're a military power. They were one of the founders of the UN. And so they are a nuclear power, and they're not just a founder of the UN, but a member of the UN Security Council. So anyway, continuing on my point about their contribution from World War II, the aftermath of the Soviet Union's collapse kind of reinforced a triumphalism that perpetuates the notion that the U.S. was responsible for defeat of Nazi Germany. Many scholars like Peter Kuznick, who teaches at American University, argues that NATO would, that the U.S. and its allies would not have been able to have D-Day without the Soviet Union defeating Germany on the Eastern Front. Further, it was it was the Red Army that liberated Auschwitz, for which we celebrate Holocaust Remembrance Day. Finally, let's see the point I was going to make. It's I forget. Well, Russia, just to say, it's finally, regarding World War II, this is overlooked in the teaching of U.S. history, but it's considered that the Nazis surrendered to Dwight Eisenhower. They actually surrendered to Eisenhower on May 8th. They surrendered to the Soviets on May 9th. So, it wasn't just a victory for the U.S. That was conducted by the U.S. And that's why the Soviet Union was a participant in founding the UN, and why they have every reason to, one, be proud of their history, and also to contribute to 21st century European security architecture. Mm-hmm. Anyway.
those are all really important points. And I think mostly that really are glossed over or just simply not spoken about by our leaders, and because we're trying to push a different narrative now, and it's almost like we're rewriting history. And this is not fair to anybody, even us, but certainly not to them, seems to me. And the other thing,
I mean, it's not fair to the world.
No, it's not.
I mean,
no.
You know, we're really, as Stephen F. Cohen argues, this is war with Russia. You know, do we really want to have war with Russia? I mean, they're very nuclear capable, and they have designed their military for a defense of their homeland, and they will not give up.
Yeah, this is a very important thing to understand. When we talk about sources a little bit more later, I'll mention that I get the things that I read from an outlet that's called Signs of the Times, which is set up in Europe by an American, but has all kinds of people from well-known people and not so well-known, but people who write, both Americans and Europeans, Asians. And so this is a way for me to kind of get a difference in point of view. And one of the articles that I came across was by an historian whose name is Igor Kolmogorov. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but he was just writing about the history of Russia and why Ukraine is so important to Russia. And as it very much ties in with what Sarah's been saying, because Russia and Ukraine, Russia actually originated in Ukraine. The Russian-speaking people, we'll get into this more later, but there's a long, long history, and what she's, what we're saying here about the war is that we were at that point allies. We didn't agree on a lot of things. We were worried about the USSR. We partitioned. Germany was partitioned so that they would have their part, we would have our part. And then we had the whole Cold War. But the fact of it was, we've had these relations with Russia for hundreds and hundreds of years in Europe, and then later in America. And to somehow act as if at this point we cannot negotiate with them, or we can't understand them, or it seems unthinkable to me anyway.
Well,
really?
Just some other post-World War history I found out this week. The word Cold War, the concept was mentioned by George Orwell in October 1945. But tellingly, the Cold War, or the Iron Curtain, is considered to have started shortly after World War II in March 1946, when Winston Churchill made a very famous Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri, and he was with the new president, Harry Truman, and many people, again, Peter Kuznick argues that if Harry Truman had not succeeded FDR when FDR died in office, that we might not have had this intense confrontation with the Soviet Union. FDR wanted to be more conciliatory, but Harry Truman was using one of his Secretary of State, I think it was James Burns, and they it was they who made the decision. I mean, not they, I mean, it was definitely collective, but not without opposition with the Truman administration. But again, Peter Kuznick argues that the decision to bomb Japan with a nuclear weapon was not necessary. The decision was made by Truman's staff with the opposition of many of his very senior leadership not to use it. But the consideration was not to save U.S. lives, and certainly Japanese lives, but to show the Soviet Union
what we could do.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm.
You know, because even during World War II, there were nuances. There was, Stalin had long argued that before they were invaded by the Nazis in 1941, but with the Nazi invasion of Czechoslovakia and Poland, Stalin had argued in favor of a British-Soviet-French alliance against the Germans, and the British would not participate. As I mentioned about Winston Churchill, Winston Churchill was very anti-Soviet. So, I mean, the alliance with the Soviets, the Allied alliance, in Churchill's view, I think, was an alliance of convenience. But during World War II, I will also say the U.S. and Britain and others, because that's when the United Nations was formulated during some of the Soviet-British U.S. conferences, I think in Potsdam and so forth. But that's when the concept for the UN was formulated, and the UN wasn't formally established until October 1945. They had their first meeting in San Francisco.
Is that when also the Security Council was established, or not until later then?
Well, I don't know I don't have off the cuff my Security Council, but they established, I think the creation of the Security Council was more nuanced. I know that the nuclear powers were going to be involved, and
well, at that point, who had nuclear power?
Just the U.S.
That's what I thought, just us.
But, the major powers in World War II were the U.S., Britain, and the U.K. Now, they brought in China and the USSR too, because of course, as I mentioned, the USSR, UK, and US were the primary allies for defeating Nazi Germany. France was a participant, but it had a provisional, I mean, it had one Vichy government, and then it had another government in exile with Charles de Gaulle. But anyway, it was the U.S. and the U.K. and the British that were establishing, let's see, yeah, the U.S., the U.K., and the USSR that were kind of formulating the plans for the UN. Chinese participation was initially, I don't have the dates on this, but it initially included Taiwan.
Well, initially it was not the communist Chinese, but it was the nationalist Chinese who were invited into the UN, and then later that evolved. That evolved, yeah.
And also the French participation. I think the French participation was more to balance out the USSR and China so that there would be 3 Western powers. But even looking now at the UN Security Council, there are arguments to be made that it should be more democratic because it doesn't represent. I mean, there are rotating members, but these 5 members are the ones that have veto power, which has the bulk of the power. However, those 5 members do not represent the majority of the world's population. It's a very, very small percentage in control of the UN vis-a-vis the Security Council. So it's always worthwhile to also check in your UN statistics what the General Assembly is saying as well.
But so now they're actually proposing that they change the composition of the Security Council?
But they've been doing that for a long time.
And they haven't
I don't know how long it will do it, how long it will take, and for something formal. There are, as I can say, there are rotating members. And but the permanent members are those 5. And they have veto power over any UN resolution.
That's a lot of power. Well, to get back to the question at hand, though, do we need to look at the map of NATO anymore? Because I think it's really interesting to see who are the original NATO members, and then who's been added, and then who's applying now. Should we take a peek at that again to see? Or what do you think?
Well, I think Finland and Sweden are the newest members, and that again is cause for concern for Russia. But I think the fact that Ukraine is not a formal member is a moot point because it has been armed by NATO members like it is a member. It's a de facto member, and that's why it has crossed Russian red lines.
Well, it's quite obvious. If you look at the map, shall we look just one more time? If we take a look again at the map, what you see is that where Ukraine is in this really important part there between Russia and Europe, and if all of Ukraine is to then suddenly join NATO, Russia has right on its border. I mean, much too close to it.
Well, we're going to show the map later on of nuclear arms control. But the point should be made. See, like there are already defensive missiles in Poland, Germany, Turkey, and Romania. And they're on Russian borders, and they can be reconfigured at any time to threaten Moscow. And we just discussed the Soviets in World War II, and they had been invaded by the West in the 19th century. And the 20th century, and also, if you consider post-World War I, they were also invaded. So they're very sensitive and should be, their sensitivities should be considered.
Certainly, yes, certainly, yeah.
But the point about the missiles in Poland, Germany, Poland, Germany, Turkey, and Romania, the thing is, these could be changed to offensive weapons. So
So they have possible offensive weapons surrounding them, pretty much here.
And they could be targeted within minutes.
Yeah. And they wouldn't know whether these were nuclear or non-nuclear weapons. Is that right? It could be either.
Well, I'm certain that they are monitoring it, and I'm certain that there are certain classifications. They know which ones are nuclear capable. But the present argument, in my understanding, is that these missiles stationed in NATO are defensive in nature, and they do not know, and their monitoring capabilities are not able to discern when these weapons become offensive. I mean, let's just say this could be done at night. They wouldn't be able to. Things can happen very quickly these days, can't they? Yes. Well, do you think, if we've answered that, should we move on to the next question? Let's see, which was regarding which we wanted the Ukraine ethnicity graph, or do you feel like we need to talk more about the can they put up the well? Do you want to do the ethnicity or and respond to those questions? Yeah, let's do it that way, and then we'll get into the teardrop and maybe all of that.
Okay, all right. Well, if you could put up then the Ukraine ethnicity graph, we can both talk about that. There we are. This is really showing you where you can see, the darkest is 100% Russian speakers. And then the next lighter, the red is where, let me see, I'll make sure I'm not saying something wrong here, but the next one is, okay, so the purple is where at least 75% of people speak Russian. The red is where 25 to 74% speak Russian. The darker orange is, say, 5% to 25%, and the way over on the east, that lighter orange is less than 5%. This, of course, corresponds to the different ethnicities that are actually make up part of Ukraine. Isn't that true?
Well, there are multiple ethnic groups, and they express their ethnicity linguistically, ethnically. The Russian population is they've all intermarried, but people, when they play Ukrainian victimhood, there were many Ukrainian when they claim Ukrainian victimhood from the Soviet Union, they overlook the fact that many Ukrainian leaders, many Soviet leaders were Ukrainian. Brezhnev, Chernenko, I think Gorbachev was supposedly half Ukrainian, and so was his wife. So for a long time, for the Soviet Union, there was at least some Ukrainian participation in the government, and there was a lot of overlap. And as I mentioned last time, Zelensky is a Ukrainian speaker, and when he had the recent diplomatic meeting in China, they made him speak they held the meetings in Russian, in the Russian language. And the responder who said that Ukrainian and Polish were closer is not correct. They're the East Slavic, West Slavic, and South Slavic, the Indo-European Slavic tongues. The East Slavic are most compatible, and they're like Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, Greater Russia. And they use the Cyrillic alphabet, which is emblematic of their missionary proselytization.
Where does that alphabet actually come from?
Well, it's influenced by the Greeks, and it supposedly it came, I mean, I don't have the date, sorry, but years ago from St. Cyril and Methodius, and he introduced made them introduce written language. And
so that goes way back. That goes really way back.
Oh, yeah. Yes. And the Western, Poland and the Czech Republic are the West Slavic, and they use the Slavic grammar, but employ the Latin alphabet. And because they were proselytized through Rome, as opposed to Greece and Constantinople.
Yeah.
And then finally, there's the South Slavic language group, which uses different alphabetical characters, not mutually exclusive, but some of each, which I'm afraid I don't know. But that's Serbo-Croatian and Bulgarian. And so, I mean, that's how the language groups are broken up. And just to clarify that.
Yeah, it was, the person who asked this, who made those comments, also commented about Crimea and the ethnicity of Crimea and how that affected what Crimea wanted to do as far as being part of Ukraine or being part of Russia. And of course, what we've said about Crimea is that Russia simply went in and took it over, and that it's so much more complicated than that, because of course
that is not true. No. There was a referendum, and Niels Melzer from the UN has said that the referendum was fair. Further, Crimea has long advocated not to be part of Ukraine and to secede from Russia, but to secede from Ukraine and be part of Russia. And this goes back to the 1990s when Sevastopol, which is the headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet, its city council or administrative institution voted in favor of being a part of Russia and seceding from Ukraine. So they voted to secede or to be part of Russia in a referendum in 2014. But that would have been a red line for Russia because Crimea had been part of Russia since Catherine the Great. It was only temporarily given to Ukraine under Nikita Khrushchev in 1954. But Crimea has long had Russian affiliations.
Yeah, and what about the population there? Because the other comment that second person made was that the Tatars were the ethnic group in Crimea, the primary one.
No,
and I don't think that's actually true either.
That's inaccurate. I think there may be a couple of 100,000 Tatars in Crimea, but it's by far a very small minority.
And where did the Tatars come from? Is there? He says they're Turkic. Is that right? They're probably
I didn't check. But given given the responders' other comments, I would check that.
Yeah, as to what ethnicity they are. Yeah.
Because who is Turkic anyway? The ancient history of these geographic areas had multiple influences, and they were settled initially by, multiple ethnic groups, tribes,
waves of different
nomads.
tribes.
So, I mean, I won't even address that.
Right, that is just too complicated. Yes, okay. So then I think we wanted to go on to the other map, which had, let's see.
Oh, we were going to go into.
Yeah.
Do we have the Putin's offer to assist the West?
Yes. Maybe you could put that up, the Putin's offer to assist the West, because this dates from 2001. Yeah.
Okay, I want to point this out because, well, one, just so you know, I was working at the Defense Intelligence Agency on September 11th, 2001, and we had to evacuate the building. But I was a Russian Soviet analyst at that time. Anyway, Putin had assumed a leadership of Russia from Boris Yeltsin, December 31st, January 1st, 2000. So he was relatively new. And at that time, Russia vehemently opposed the war in NATO's war on Yugoslavia, which was the first time NATO was used without a UN mandate. And the Russian ambassador to the U.S., Primakov, was on his way to the U.S. at that time in 1999, and he had his plane returned. He reversed his plane. So anyway, but Russia has wanted Gorbachev, when he announced the end of the Cold War, his vision was for a greater Europe and a peaceful Europe, and he was hoping for improved relations. So Yeltsin and Vladimir Putin were working on that. So despite this disagreement on the war in Yugoslavia, Vladimir Putin was the first head of state, or one of the first, to call President Bush or National Secretary of, I don't know whether she was National Security Advisor or Secretary of State, but Condoleezza Rice. He either called Bush or Condoleezza Rice as one of the first heads of state. And they offered condolences. And later on, Vladimir Putin, within weeks, he made those proposals that were just shown. And if you want to show them again.
Show them again, because
this was against the advice of many hardliners within Russia's cabinet. But anyway, they offered this assistance, but the U.S. rejected it.
And if you look at it too, to share intelligence, to open Russian airspace for providing humanitarian assistance, to cooperate with Russia's Central Asian allies to facilitate assistance, participate in international search and rescue operations, and increase direct assistance, humanitarian and military. I mean, this is quite an offer.
Yeah, and they did. I'm sure the U.S. did, and the coalition did take up Central Asia, because Central Asia was utilized to employ, to get into Afghanistan.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I'm sure that. Now can we have the teardrop memorial?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, we'll go to the teardrop.
Yes, yes, I think that's good then. So we can just quickly about the teardrop, that was a present then to the United States.
And it was ridiculed. Well, we'll do the ABM treaty first. Okay. Anyway, to make a long story short, Vladimir Putin had made this 24 September proposal for non-military, quasi-military assistance to the U.S. Then in December of that same year, George W. Bush announced that he was going to withdraw from the anti-ballistic missile treaty with Russia. And then that started a pattern of nuclear arms control withdrawal by the U.S. from nuclear arms control agreements. And one of the responders to our points made the point, well, Russia had more egregious violations than expansion of NATO. Well, what can be more egregious than withdrawing from a nuclear arms control agreement? And then Trump withdrew, despite what everybody says about Trump being a Putin puppet. Trump withdrew from the Open Skies Treaty November 2020. And the Open Skies Treaty allowed for this overhead surveillance that is necessary to determine what nuclear weapons are deployed. So we no longer have that now. And then Trump also withdrew from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which in 2017. So all of our arms control agreements except one, I think it's START 2, which has been renewed, have been rescinded by the U.S. And then following that line of broken agreement, the Iran nuclear deal, which was broken by Trump. But before we close, I'll get into one other gesture that Russia did that was rebuffed, was the teardrop memorial. And we can't show it here, but I recommend people look it up. And its story is on Wikipedia. And it was made by its artists and the people of Russia to the people of, to the victims of world terrorism. And what happened with that, the New Yorker said it looked like a giant tea biscuit. Now, I'm no artist, but this was a very well-known, well-respected Russian artist who created this memorial. And I invite the viewers to look it up. You can find it online. It was also considered by the Foreign Policy magazine as one of the ugliest statues. And
see if you think that, if you look at it. I certainly don't think so. But anyway.
And then in 2010, the New York Port Authority announced that it would likely have to be moved. And but a New York taxi driver took up a petition. I don't know, to preserve it, but I don't know exactly what its status is. But I invite.
Do you know where it is now, even where it is?
I think it's in New Jersey,
New Jersey somewhere.
But I'm still not sure. And it's Bayonne, New Jersey.
Yeah. So that's a sad commentary that a real gesture of friendship was so rebuffed.
Yeah, but anyway, to me, that epitomizes the attitude of NATO expansion. We don't care what the Russians think. And I invite, consideration. I mean, don't they have a right to determine what's on their borders? Wouldn't the U.S. be offended slightly if Russia and China were arming Mexico or Canada?
Think of it. Yes. Yes, exactly. Yes. Yes. Well, yes. Well, this. Thank you so much. This mostly answers, I think, the comments that we got. There were some other things that were said, but it's a matter really of everyone looking at various sources for their information. The problem right now is that being in the midst of
not just different sources, different points of view.
Exactly, different points of view. Right. So that, yes, because you can, if you go onto mainstream TV, you'll find that CNN and Fox and all often say the same thing. So yes, indeed,
and it's part of the propaganda mechanism. Repeat the message over and over again until people accept it as truth.
Yeah, yeah. So you have to look at multiple sources if you have the opportunity to do that, and try to find out ones that you can trust. And I think, I know in my case, I like to read things. Some people like to listen to all the talking heads on TV. I find that not particularly informative. I think that when you can actually read something that somebody has written, as Sarah has mentioned, and if you can't read books, you can read articles. I mean, there's a lot that comes up online now. There are ways, there are places where you can go for information that and
like this program.
Well, like this program, right? And what I think both of us have found is, Sarah, we don't have time to talk about today, but another time you talk about, you visited some of these places. Sarah has been to Russia. She's been to what some of the other countries.
I've been to the Czech Republic. Yeah. Or it was Czechoslovakia then. I've been to Austria. I've been to,
And it makes a real difference when you've been to a country and you can see it for yourself. Or somebody who's been there. So I think that as Americans, we need to realize that the rest of the world doesn't necessarily think the way we think, and that it really behooves us to find out as much as we can and be certainly at least open to what's coming our way. And I think for me a guideline is if you hear somebody being vilified, and for instance with Putin, I have found that even if every once in a while I've heard his speeches on TV, he speaks in Russian all the time, so I have to get what he's saying through the translation. But it does me it does me good to hear him, to hear what he has to say instead of.
He has 80% approval.
Yeah, so
which any U.S. Western politician, even Western Europe, would envy now.
Would certainly envy, yeah. And that's probably, even including with the war, which I don't think anybody is happy about, certainly not Russians, not us, not anybody. And so I think that in terms of what we can do about Ukraine, we can inform ourselves, and we can say that we as Americans, we want peace. We can see how Ukraine is suffering. We can see that it's being torn apart.
They're being used as pawns because Russia overwhelmingly has military superiority. NATO has armed Ukraine to the extent that NATO is now running low logistically, And Russia is just beginning. They've said they're just beginning.
And that's a scary proposition, which I don't think anybody would
They're
show.
using Ukrainians as pawns, just like so many U.S. politicians have said, fight to the last Ukrainian. Well, do we want to destroy the male population of Ukraine?
These are all very important questions, and I think we do have to think about what it is our tax dollars are supporting. And right now, it's supporting war. And if we don't want war, we have to insist that we want people to start considering peace. So that's a thought I'm leaving with you. Do you have a final thought you'd like to leave with people?
My thought is just back to one of the earlier comments. I really don't think Vladimir Putin had a choice, because with facing a threat to Russia, facing operations against Russian-speaking people in the Donbass, and the U.S. and the West had proven they were agreement incapable and had broken the Minsk I and II agreements. So I think the motives were, Zelensky had said in the 2022 Munich Security Conference that he was going to rescind Ukraine's nuclear-free status, and that and the potential Ukrainian operations against the people of the Donbass, which the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, a U.S. institution, had said that 14,000 people have been killed in the Donbass.
So we have to end for today, but thank you very much for listening.